Here we go. So I think we're all set. Might want to give another moment while people come in and get themselves settled, virtually, so to speak, for our webinar. But want to thank everyone for being here. Let's take a moment. So I can get us started. I just want to thank everyone who's been able to make time in their busy schedules to be with us. I know we have a message from our SEEP friends welcoming everybody to today's presentation. I'm Joshua Castano from Partners for Sacred Places on behalf of a really wonderful team of amazing experts and leaders who are going to be speaking to us for the next about 40 minutes or so before we have some question and answer time. So thanks everybody for making yourselves available to be here and to present. So I'm really glad to be part of this. There is a question about slides, and recording of this webinar presentation will be all available through SEEP. So SEEP will be sending out follow-up emails and information to everybody who's attended and registered today. So you'll be able to access that information. So I just want to take one moment to highlight all the great people who are a part of today's presentation. My colleague, Robert Yeager from Partners for Sacred Places. Bob, would you like to say something about yourself?
Just delighted to be here. We have a huge audience, so it's exciting to share our thoughts and our experience today.
Great. And Bob is a co-founder at Partners. He's been leading Partners since 1989 and is a national expert on historic preservation issues related to historic houses of worship and religious properties, and has been an author of a number of important seminal publications in this field. I'm Joshua Castano again from Partners for Sacred Places. I'm the Director of Community Engagement Services there, and also am a preservationist by training and background with experience in community development, and oversee a number of different projects and client services that Partners provides. And I'd like to introduce James Shepard, who's the principal and the Director of Historic Preservation Work at SmithGroup. Jim, would you like to say something about yourself?
Sure. I'm thrilled to be a part of this discussion today, and I know it's a topic that's in the foremost of everyone's minds. So my background is also historic preservation. I was in the private practice for about 20 years, and then I shifted over to be the Director of Preservation Facilities for Washington National Cathedral for 7 years, and I just recently joined SmithGroup about 6 months ago to lead their historic preservation. But obviously, I'm always concerned with and wanting to help contribute to the stewardship of our historic churches.
Great. So glad to have you here today. And then I'd love to introduce the Reverend Marek Zawrisky, the rector at Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. Marek, would you like to say something about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Joshua. I've been at Christ Church as rector for about 1.5 years now. So I'm still in a huge learning phase of understanding this whole community. It's a great, great church. I was in my previous church, St. Thomas in White Marsh, just outside of Philadelphia for 23 years as rector. And before that, I served churches in Richmond and in Nashville, Tennessee.
I have to say, I forgot something, which is that I'm the treasurer at St. Mark's in Philadelphia, and I'm sorry to say that Marek is no longer in our diocese, but we're glad that the Episcopal Church in Connecticut has it, but sorry that he's no longer serving in this diocese. And George Belshaw is the senior warden at Christ Church. Would you like to say something about yourself, George?
Well, thank you for including me in Christ Church in this presentation. We've been participating in numerous SEEP webinars, and they've really been tremendously helpful for us. And so we're thrilled to be part of this. And yes, I am the senior warden at Christ Church, and we're thrilled to have Marek as our new rector.
Great. I know, George, for people like us who are officers of our vestry, of course, this is really the thing on our resume that we love the most, isn't it?
That it is, yes.
Well, great. Well, we're going to dive in. The game plan for today's presentation is myself and Bob will kind of give us just an overview and introduction to kind of look at the larger topics and issues we're going to be discussing in detail today. Then we're going to invite George and Merrick to give us an in-depth look at the work that they've been doing at Christ Church and give us some sense of what tips and insights they bring to this topic. And then lastly, ask Jim to jump in and let us know a little bit more about that very complicated issue related to all of this, which is our buildings and our physical infrastructure. And so Jim will lead us through that. And then we'll reserve at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this for question and answer, which I know for me is always the my favorite part of this. That is just a housekeeping note before we dive in, though. You should see a chat box icon at the end of your toolbar, at the bottom of your screen, most likely. You can introduce yourself, let us know where you're from, what parish or church you're representing, which would be great. But there's also a separate icon there. It's Q&A, and the Q&A has two little thought bubbles, sort of like in the old cartoons. We'll use that when we get to the moderated Q&A portion of the presentation, and that's where we'll ask you to put your formal questions for that Q&A section. I'll give a reminder when we get to that point, but wanted to give you a heads up now. So with that, I'd like Bob Yeager to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And we just wanted to spend a couple of moments kind of talking about where we are now and what's changing. So if we can go to the next slide, Joshua, thank you. Well, we all shut down fast. We recall that 2-3 months ago that everything shut down dizzyingly fast. And now we're beginning to open in different ways at different paces. I was talking to a bishop this week. Her diocese is still completely shut down, but other dioceses, of course, are starting to change based on local laws and regulations and the encouragement of our public sector. So some churches are beginning to open a little bit, some more so, some are still completely shut down. And I think we all think it's going to be more of a challenge to open than it was to close, because how do we do it safely and carefully and thoughtfully and continue to use our buildings and our facilities to live out our work and to serve a community that arguably is in much greater need than it was 3 or 4 months ago. So we're seeing a range of activity and practices, and we want to talk a bit about some best practices. But I think the good news is there's been so much churn and so much change in our communities that we have an opportunity to use our assets in new ways. And we'll want to talk a bit about how are we in conversation with our civic leaders and what new things might we do, but still safely and carefully. We love the message, by the way, of this banner that's been put up by Trinity Episcopal Church in Covington, Kentucky. The rector there, Peter D'Angelo, is on our board, and we know Peter well. And as a result of an earlier SEAT Network webinar, he was inspired to put up 3 banners like this to say to his community, they may not be fully open yet, but they are still there. They're there to serve. Next slide. There we go. And as we, again, think about bringing new activity and programming and perhaps worship, et cetera, back into our buildings, it's useful to remind ourselves of the enormous impact we have had in the past. So this is data based on research we've done, of course, before the pandemic, but it showed that your average urban church brought $1.7 million in value to its community every year, which included the sharing of space, the spending of all the budgets of the church, the hiring of local folks, the attraction of people to the community to attend events, what we call the magnet effect. So when you add all that up, it's an enormous amount of money and impact that your average church tends to have in its community. That's all the things we used to do. So I think the question is, what can we bring back to our buildings in a thoughtful and careful way in the coming months? But this is a good context for what churches have tended to do for our communities in the past. Joshua?
Thanks, Bob. So along those lines, one of the other key findings from our economic halo effect study, and some of you may have seen this research before, I hope you have, and if you haven't, please look at Sacred Places website where there is information and a download of this national pilot study. But one of the other key figures from that study I want to point out, because this is an important one as we think about reopening today, and it really relates directly to our topic, is this figure. So we looked at the total number of visits to all of the congregations that were included in that national study. And this graph represents a way that we divided the purpose of those visits, what kind of activity it was. And you'll see that worship represents 11%. Only 11%. Now, I tend to be the kind of person who thinks about this actually as a really hopeful and empowering statistic that congregations are able to use to tell a really incredible story about their impact and their value to the wider community. But for the purposes of our conversation today, while that we want to hold that in mind as well, we also want to highlight the fact that it emphasizes how much other activity is so often a part of the week in, week out use that's taking place in our buildings. And so our reopening, obviously liturgical worship in life is at the heart of everything, and it is at the center of what drives what our congregations are and what they are doing. But the ripple effect, the impact is bigger than that. And so, reopening plans are going to need to be bigger than just thinking necessarily about worship, while that may be the primary and most important or pressing concern for reopening plans. Now, many of us may be already inundated, with a variety of information that's out there. There is a ton of guidance that's being produced. There's guidance from states, there's guidance from municipalities, especially if you're in larger cities and counties, and there's also diocesan guidance. I think the average page number of the diocesan guides I've seen is somewhere between 25 to 35 pages. So this is a lot of information. So one of the things we want to encourage you to think about is discern what guidance is out there and what is going to be really most useful and important to you. You may have to weigh a couple of different sets of factors at the same time. So this is going to be really key in terms of balance. The other thing is you don't have to be all or nothing. There's likely we see throughout the country, and Partners is seeing this in our experience, talking to congregations in many different regions, there's going to be a phased approach. So there are going to be steps. So one way to think about a reopening plan is what are milestones that may be parallel to some of the milestones diocesan guidance is setting and requiring, or municipal guidance and state guidance is setting. So a reopening plan that's in sync with all of that, might seem, like a lot of work to put together, but having phases is important. And I think this also speaks to setting expectations with people. Reopening doesn't mean turning on a switch and the full current is there. It really means a phased, step-by-step approach to it's not really, but really getting back to doing activity in your building, doing group activity, doing ministry and programs. The other thing is really thinking about all of the people who use the building. And why that matters is they all use the building differently, different times, different purposes, different scenarios there. Also, different vulnerabilities for all of the different groups that are using the building. So thinking about the user groups, you have staff and parishioners, volunteers. You also have non-members. You have people who are coming in from outside of the parish, youth, elderly, maybe people who are especially vulnerable, especially if you're doing ministries like those that minister to those experiencing homelessness, for instance, where you have real vulnerabilities there to infection. So there's a range of people that use the building. So a plan has got to be flexible to think about and incorporate all the different user groups. The other thing is, what are some of the best practices? There are a lot of requirements that dioceses are putting out. There's a lot of restrictions that states are setting, but what might be best practices that, for instance, there's a lot of conversation right now around music, choral music and congregational singing. There's a wide conversation around what might be emerging best practices in the near term for that. What are some of the other ones in social service and food distribution programs? Are social service agencies taking a lead in a conversation around that? So this is that's one of those other things to really keep in mind here. Another thing about putting together a plan is, what are the priorities or goals? And that may seem obvious. Well, we want to get back to our full ministry, but I think it's actually a little bit more subtle than that. It really is, while you want to be prudent and cautious, and you want to develop a timeline and milestones that are important, what are your near-term priorities? What are your long-term priorities? Do you want people to feel connected in terms of worship and gathering? Do you want to get back to ministering to those people in your community and the ministries that you've had to suspend, like food distribution or ministry to those experiencing homelessness? What are the expectations of your leaders and your members, but also your community partners? There may be lots of community groups or other civic institutions that are looking to know what you're doing and what your plan is, and when might you return to some of your service and work. So there's a lot of expectations there. That's really important. So evaluate what you want to accomplish here as well, and pay attention and listen to people. We keep talking about reopening because so many things have closed, but I think what Bob pointed out too is things have closed, but there's a range across the country. Some things have closed entirely, and other parishes have been able to sustain some kind of activity. So likewise, we want to think about reopening as not going back to the building, but really moving forward. The landscape is changing. We all know that. There's going to be a somewhat different opportunity for the church, a very different set of challenges and opportunities for our communities that our congregations are embedded in and serve. And so what does this plan take into account in terms of the future, the long term? What are we going back to? What might need to change in terms of the way we do business, the way we access our building, the way that our building functions, the way that we schedule and operate ministries and programs, the way that we think about the vulnerable and those who are especially susceptible to health pandemics and circumstances. So, that's a really key piece here. Don't think that your plan has to mimic or follow exactly somebody else's. Your buildings are all different. Your communities are different. Your neighborhoods are different. Your staffing and congregation sizes are different. So a plan that there's not really a one size that fits all parish plan. That's really key. The other thing is not to rush. There may be a lot of energy around, gosh, we really want to be together again. We really want to be together. But it's important to communicate that you're doing this work and you're planning, but don't rush it. This needs to be a thoughtful, carefully considered process. Obviously, again, being prudent and cautious. As I said before, you want to be careful about the expectations that you're setting. And lastly, flexibility. The science and medicine the medical science is still emerging about what this may look like in 6 months from now, this particular pandemic. There's information out there about other situations we may find ourselves in the future. Being prepared as a society, we've seen we were not quite prepared for this pandemic. So having a plan that's not just about this moment, okay, we want to get back to, or our pattern of worship and parochial life and service and community engagement. But how can that plan also account for the fact that you might have to take one step back? So in thinking about a plan, what are your steps? Because there might be a situation that arises where maybe there's a second wave or even a third wave and you have to take a step back. What might be some other challenges you encounter? So having a plan that's flexible, I think also allows you not to feel disheartened or discouraged if you do have to take a step back, or you do have to change or moderate a step in your plan that you had originally shared with your community and your congregation. So flexibility is going to be really key here. with all that in mind, we really want you to hear from the leadership at Christ Church, because they have done some really excellent work and I think have a lot of wisdom to share with us. So I'm going to invite George and Merrick to come on board and share with us a little bit of what they've done.
Thank you, Joshua. George and I thought I'd start, and then I'll turn it over to him with much more detail on this. The first thing I'd just like to corroborate what you just said. It's far easier to shut down than to open up. We made the decision to shut down, let's say on a Wednesday, and Friday, that was it. We were out. And it didn't take a lot of coalition building and things like that, looking at scientific research. So it is a whole lot easier to turn the switch off than it is to turn it back on. We also wanted to get ahead of the curve in the reopening. So I think that's a vital thing for all of us to be doing. So we started working together about 5 weeks ago. We didn't want to rush the reopening plans, just as you have suggested, because we're a large, complex organization, and there are a lot of different components to bring online. I know the governors are talking about you can bring certain parts of the state back on quicker than others, and certain industries than others. We're all in the same boat. The wardens wanted to have a task force that was rather small, so we've limited it to 9 people. We have our 2 wardens, our treasurer, a vestry member at large, our 4 full-time clergy, and our director of our preschool. And then in addition, we've built a reopening advisory committee that has 15 people on it. And on that, we've included 2 physicians, 1 nurse, 2 lawyers, and several outstanding business leaders and former wardens. And that way, the thing we're trying to do is build, engender trust among our congregation. Think of it as like building a search committee and assembling that. You want people to be able to look at the names of the folks on there and say, I recognize them, these are great folks. They're going to get the job done and do it well. So I think that's something for all of us to keep in mind. I also think it's good to involve, say, in a larger church, say 25 people. I know one church that's larger than us that has the interim rector and the wardens are doing all the planning. I think that's putting probably too much weight on too few people to carry this out, especially if you have a lot of moving parts that you have to bring back online. The key advice that I'd offer to folks at this time is start early, recruit outstanding people who will engender trust in the congregation, cover the breadth of what you have to do and bringing things back online, buildings, worship, programming, and bring the congregation along as you do this, rather than keep them in the dark. One way to do that is to survey them and let them have something to say in the matter. Christ Church Greenwich operates 100,000 square feet of buildings located on a 14-acre campus with a 1,600-member congregation. We hold 4 Sunday services. We have 8 choirs, one of the larger choral programs in the Episcopal Church, and it's an outstanding and vital part of what we're about. A Sunday school, youth groups, a weekday preschool with 105 students, a significant bookstore that does about $250,000 in sales each year, and 12 12-step programs. And so that's a lot of people with the halo effect that the Partners for Sacred Spaces talks about. There's just a lot of traffic coming in and out, and traditionally the doors have been virtually wide open all the time, almost excessively. We have the Greenwich Suzuki Academy rent space from us, so there are lots of music students coming, and then we do other rentals, and we have lots of weddings and funerals. We decided early on to stage our reentry, and we've developed a color-coded staging process that our senior wardens done a great job with. And by the way, our wardens have been spectacular. I have to think they're the best in the country, and our staff has been phenomenal and risen to the occasion across the board. We're also in close sync with the diocese, which is known here as the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, or ECCT. And our bishops, Ian Douglas and Laura Ahrens, have been outstanding at keeping the clergy and the wardens closely connected. Every Wednesday morning, we have a 1-hour conversation with them, and they present some thoughts and then open up to questions and answers, and lots of great resources have been posted there. Last week, we had 198 people participate in that Zoom call. So most of the churches in the Episcopal Church of Connecticut are waiting until around June 20th to reopen. We are planning to reopen on June 7th. Here in Greenwich, restaurants are reopening today with outdoor dining. And it's a community with 8 different country clubs. They're opening for service outdoors as well at this time. We've got hair salons and beauty parlors are opening up on June 1st. So to say that we can't open up worship till after that, begs the question. We think it's safe in what we're doing, and we're going to go ahead on June 7th. And we had a conversation today with the clergy from around the Greenwich area. They're all looking at opening it at different times, but we're able to get in sync with what others are doing as well. We anticipate opening up with a 9 o'clock service that we will imagine could be quickly subscribed to. So then we're going to prepare for an 8 o'clock service in addition to that. The service will be held outdoors. It will be a 50-person service. And then we'll continue with our live stream worship indoors with just the clergy and the musicians alone. And then we normally have a 5 o'clock compline service. We may bring something back online at that time if there's overflow need with the amount of people who want to come back to worship at this time. So we have a plan to have an online sign up for worship. And as you click to do that, you'll have to click on a waiver. Because we want to protect the church from being sued. Of course, someone can sue you no matter what, but we want to state carefully what needs to be done. And in the survey, we've put together what the service would look like, and we'll reiterate that to everyone who joins us. That will include that we'll celebrate the Eucharist, but not distribute communion at the time. We'll have 2 or 4 of our clergy present and 4 singers, and then 2 ushers to check temperatures as people arrive on the site. That basically leaves room for about 40 other people to join us in worship. They'll all be seated 6 feet or further apart. There'll be no leaflets, no congregational singing, and no exchange of the peace at this time or passing of a collection plate. But there will be a collection plate where people can make a contribution to. Everyone will wear masks. They'll bring their own chairs, and we'll try to discourage them from staying and socializing afterwards. So we're following the protocols of the Episcopal Church of Connecticut, listening to our governor. We've looked at protocols from all sorts of different dioceses. And one of the people on our reopening advisory committee is on the reopening task force for IBM. So we're getting all sorts of different intel as we do this.
Merritt, can I ask you one quick question? I know before George jumps in, which is, were there any questions or key areas of your reopening concerns that your diocese guidance didn't address? So were there some topics that you guys had to think about as a parish that weren't necessarily taken into consideration by the diocese guidance?
Well, the bookstore, is something different that we have. We have a bookstore that we've actually brought back online Tuesday through Thursday from 10 o'clock until 4 p.m. And so people can call, purchase a book, talk to one of the employees, ask for recommendations, and then have books put in bags waiting for them to pick up at the door, and they're making a few home deliveries. But that was something that we had to deal with it. I'm not sure there's another bookstore in the diocese, and if there are, they're just a handful. So certain things like that we had to sort out on our own. And
what about, the programs or community serving ministries that use your building? Have you talked to, has that been part of the conversation with your task force, and have you talked to those folk?
So we've segmented, and George can get into this, different areas. We have to bring online the building. We have to bring online worship. We have to bring online getting staff back into the place. And our experience is that we have a spectrum of reactions. We have some people who feel very comfortable coming back right now. They can work there full time, probably. Others who, view it as like an invitation to come back to Chernobyl. So I think we have to kind of mediate that concern and fear and come up with the practices that will work for us. We have learned to work effectively remotely, but I think it's taking 50% more energy to do this remotely and to build consensus and have these conversations, and people are getting zoomed out. We also have people who have young families at home working with both spouses, trying to work full time for us. a lot of this is pretty unmanageable. Everyone's back to cleaning their own home, doing all their shopping, often on their own. And it's a lot of stuff. And one thing I would say for all the clergy watching and for any wardens, et cetera, I think this is an extremely stressful time for clergy because you're not only operating a church, you are building a new church on the side. It's like you're moonlighting and you've got a 50%, extra part of you building that next portion. So to try to keep balance is just vital for all of us. And dampen down expectations, just kind of keep them balanced.
I think maybe this is a great moment. George, were you going to walk us through the survey that you did with the parish?
Sure. I just to add a little color to what Merrick was saying. We did put together a leadership team, and an advisory group. We're also going to be putting together, we believe, an implementation team once we have all our parameters and guidances put in place. We, looked at our worship team, looked at different ways that we could potentially have worship. We've also had, the various groups that we have spelled out are physical plant group, worship team, bookstore team, the office and staff, that's critical, our nursery school, programming and hospitality, weddings and funerals, non-parish usage and outreach, and then we have pastoral care team, communications, which is vital. So it's key that we communicate all this well to our parishioners, as well as insurance and a legal team, making sure that we are following best practices. And then what I just wanted to add this little piece. This was not part of our original areas that we wanted to focus on. But after a few meetings, we recognized that there's some good ideas that are coming out of all of this. And so we're putting together a little group that's going to be just taking the good ideas that come out of all this and trying to see how we can strategize and utilize them as we reopen and become the new church that we will become. And we're recognizing that we're not going to be exactly the same. So let's use some of this energy to figure out some new ideas. So we spoke about how can we do worship and limited number of people we can have meeting, a lot of issues. I mean, it's just overwhelming the amount of information that's being thrown at us. One of the reasons why we broke up into small groups. After reading all the guidances from the various sources, we thought, well, let's try outside. Since restaurants are going to be outside, we can have some worship outside. So we thought we'd test our parish to get their thoughts on this. So we did a little survey, and I think that's what you're interested in seeing. And I'm going to give a try here at sharing the screen here. And okay. There we go. Church propaganda there. Here we go. And this is what the church looks like. So if you haven't been to Christ Church in Greenwich, this is a cross we put up for Easter. We couldn't obviously decorate the inside of the church, so we had a little fun and created a little cross, wonderful cross outside out front. So that's Easter, the inside of the church, which we recently restored. And you can see we have about 14 acres. So what you see here is the church and another outbuilding called the Tomes Higgins House. So we're looking to have worship outside around our Tomes Higgins House building there. So we sent out a survey, which basically asked people if they'd be interested in participating. It's likely that any church service, whether outdoor or indoor, will require safety precautions, including, but not limited to, forehead temperature taken before entry, wearing a face mask, standing and sitting at least 6 feet from others, certainly those who are not in one's own household, avoiding any physical contact, avoiding crowded hallways, use of wipes on doors, handles, and other surfaces. No Holy Communion. We will require reservations, and we're looking to have not include kids under 7. The reason for that is because it's just hard to control little kids. They don't quite understand social distancing. So we felt it was best not to include young kids. So that were the parameters. The first question was, how interested would you be in attending a live service with the restrictions? Sorry, I can't see the whole screen here. But and as you can see, it basically was divided up into thirds. And I will note we had a pretty good response rate. This went out on Tuesday, and here we are on Thursday, and we've already had, as an hour or so ago, 329 responses. So that's pretty good representation, I think. We had, you can see the blue, very interested. Some folks are very interested, somewhat interested, and not at all interested. So broke it up into 3 parts there. During the summer months, would you be more interested in attending indoor or outdoor services with the safety restrictions? You can see that, which we were encouraged by, only 10.6% of the respondents were in favor of just doing indoor. Most of them were outdoor, and some continued to be online. And then there was a group in green that was in the above, so willing to do participate. They just want to participate. So we were encouraged by this because it indicated that people didn't have to be inside to worship. We did an age. We asked people what their ages just to get a sense of the respondents. Not surprising, Episcopal Church, most people responded over 65, as well as in the 50s and 64 range. And there is in here somewhere, there's a little line there, which we had one person between 18 and 29, so in a response. So this is just useful. And the last question was, do you have children age 18 or younger who live with you and who regularly attend church with you? And this was just, we put this out just to get a sense of how many people would, that have young children who who would not come or felt they couldn't come. But so most respondents obviously would like to go, would like to attend, and are able to come and not be restricted by children. So that's, it was very simple. We didn't want to make it complex. But it was revealing to us that most of our folks, at least those who responded, were who are interested in attending an outside service. So that was the little service we put out in a survey. We found it quite useful. So I don't want to take up too much time. So we only have 10 minutes left. So I'll stop right there. Josh, I will ask any questions or move on to Jim.
That's great. I think one of the really great things I heard both of you say was about listening to all the ideas that are coming up and holding them, maybe not addressing them right away, but demonstrating to people that you want to follow up with thinking about them. I think that's another really great thing and speaks to the whole need to think about this as not going back, but really going forward, right. So that's pretty wonderful. I want to make sure we have some time for Jim to talk about buildings and, obviously thinking about our wonderful, beautiful, special places that we use, and share a little bit of guidance on what people in his field are doing to help us all think about this.
Sure, let me just unmute myself. I'm going to share my screen. If I can do this, let's see. Okay. Full screen. Okay, so I'm coming at this a little bit differently. Obviously, I'm an architect with historic preservation experience, and SmithGroup, the firm I currently now work for, has spent a lot of time in the last several weeks developing something to give out to their clients. So you're going to see this and think, well, why am I showing this to you? A lot of similar overlays, I think, to what Merrick and George have emphasized about both the survey process and the sort of phased reopening process. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We will make sure this is available to you. But there's some good things towards the end about what you can do with your buildings themselves, about spacing distances, dealing with your mechanical systems, and other things. So again, just I think a lot of this was already introduced by George and Merrick, setting up a framework and being flexible. Obviously, you've got historic buildings, you've got a bunch of people eager to get back together and congregate, and regather, as I think somebody said, instead of reopen. So it's important that you remain flexible. And I think it's also just a reminder to think about sort of our overall well-being. I think Merrick referenced this, we've all been under a lot of stress. So thinking about the physical, social, mental aspects that contribute to regathering. And looking at a more holistic approach. So this has to do with not only considering the physical, the space protocols, but thinking about process, the human and social engagement, managing change. We Episcopalians don't like a lot of change too fast. Well, this whole environment has pushed us that way, and how you deal with that, and then also just setting up some sort of real estate paradigm for how to address our physical environment. I won't dwell on this too much, but obviously the SmithGroup did what Merrick and George did, which is a survey. I think it's a very important thing to make sure you're building consensus amongst your congregation and your building users. Because I think in the end, at least for us in a corporate environment, it teased out that a lot of people actually are more worried about going back to an environment where they're going to be threatened than they are about staying home. So that's something we have to, I think, about as the churches start to encourage regathering, is making sure that people feel safe and want to come back. And this is just, I think, a good sort of spell out of process. The discovery zone, which was the survey I think that George and Merrick presented, as to gathering your leadership and getting your employees and your congregation to give buy-in. Then defining space requirements. What's it mean to come back into your spaces? When you overlay a 6-foot distance around you, how many people can you fit in your worship spaces? How do you deal with your administrative support spaces and your bathrooms? So developing what the constrictions are, and then developing guidelines about how to address them. A cleaning policy. How do you clean your building environment and the things that people touch, that's also impacting the limiting use of hymnals that we're all used to, and creating something as a part of the worship that is either disposable, or being able to use your iPhone for programs and worship so that it's more individual and you're not having to touch as much. And then managing the change. This is a lot of change. So how do you manage all that? So this touches a little bit on assembling your team members. I think George talked about how to assemble those, making sure you've got the right resources around the table, leadership, human resources, the legal, the various people who can help contribute. In this case, this says start with your employees, but really it's start with your congregation, right? And getting insight from them about what their interest is about coming back and how they want to come back. And then also, I think this is sort of an interesting thing about determining the why. Why are we coming back, and what is the goal for coming back? And being very specific and intentional about that, and what people are going to show up and get out of it when we do regather. And I just sort of think this diagram is interesting. It sort of suggests our spaces in the future, about big open spaces where people have to be spaced at appropriate distances. I think these are sort of 5 good sort of core overriding philosophies as you advance through all this. Be safe, making sure you're thinking about how your worship spaces are going to be safe. Be human, make sure the choices you're making are still allowing for the pastoral side of worship. Be flexible, as we mentioned already. Be effective in making sure your good choices are leading to supporting what you're doing and being equitable. So about the space, this has more to do with making sure you're taking proper consideration of all the various things about your space. For our office environment, but it's also applicable to the churches. How do you deal with the childcare component? A lot of, obviously, people come when they worship, they're needing to have the childcare during the services. That's, for the most part, off limits at the moment until we've solved how to address a cleanly environment that's not going to spread things. But also, how do people get to the worship space regarding public transportation, and how do you make sure that they are staying healthy while still maintaining an emotional well-being? I also, this slide's a really important one, just because you want to make sure you're considering the various things that lead to a safe environment. What are your risk points in your worship spaces? And where might people interact or not interact in too close an environment? Think about the physical distancing. applying a one-way circulation plan so that, again, you're trying to keep people from overlapping in the short term. And then, making sure you're being safe with your environment, making sure you're cleaning your surfaces, and yet you're being equitable and safe in your collaboration. This is more office related, obviously, but it does overlay the concern about collaboration zones. Where in your congregation and in your building are people going to gather? How do you make sure that they are spaced appropriately and distanced in the very near future? And this is just an example of a sort of a study of a layout of an office plan, but you could very easily do this for a congregation and a worship space, about sort of overlaying circles of people's clearance of 16 feet around them, a 16-foot diameter, to make sure that they're seated in a proper way. It's a good way to test your worship space to see how many people can fit. You can see this diagram as to what that does to short-term the number of people you can fit. The arrows are showing a circulation paths and safety. A couple of things to consider from an engineering standpoint for your building. Obviously, people are emphasizing making sure you have face masks and you're keeping a safe distance. But also things to consider are putting improved filters on your air handlers so that the air is being properly filtered. There's suggestions of ionization and applying ultraviolet to your mechanical systems to improve their activity and reduce aerosols. And there's also a recent study about relative humidity in spaces, in particular worship spaces, about keeping relative humidity at 40% or higher. They say that that reduces the air surface ineffectivity here it says workspace, but also just improving human viral response. So it's sort of an interesting thing about what to consider with your worship spaces and how you mitigate humidity and reduce risk. Now, in this case, we talked about landlords. A lot of you are landlords. So what does that mean regarding the people returning into your space? Because they will have their own ideas of what they need from your space as a tenant. So just making sure that you're thinking through the space usage and protocols, the various technology requirements, and also bringing your employees back on site and making sure that they feel safe within the environment as they return to your worship campuses. Health and safety is a big one, and I think there was just an article in the Washington Post yesterday about one of the biggest fears for people coming back to public gathering spaces is bathrooms, and how do you mitigate those bathrooms and keep them safe. There are lots of ideas now about non-touch response things like infrared soap dispensers and faucets, as well as doors that have actuators so that you can not have to touch a handle. What's interesting is about a year ago, the cathedral, Washington National Cathedral, put in sinks with integral soap dispensers and hand dryers. And one of the things I think that is at first target in these bathrooms, particularly public bathrooms, is taking away the hand dryers because they blow the residual water on your hands all over the bathroom. In this case, at the cathedral, they're integral with a sink, so they actually dispose of all of that issue right at the sink. So just something to consider as you're retrofitting your spaces to bring people back. And I should have highlighted here, cleaning protocol. You know, a lot of you are going to have to deal with your facility staff and a new protocol for cleaning. And what does that mean? What is the intensity? You might have to ramp up your staff, and that, of course, results in money. So thinking about how you're going to address that, and also providing personal protection equipment for your staff, and having a worship community come with their own, making sure you've got an adequate supply of tissues and disinfecting gel and personal protection equipment. So I think Merrick and George already mentioned this about the legal resources, making sure you've got the legal team to help you as you advance all this, because there are things that may become a sticky wicket. And then just the transition. Obviously, all of this is taking a mental toll on us. And I think, as Merrick suggested, a lot of us are doing double jobs, trying to do our day job and translate how this works to additional response to all this. A lot of you are already living in both a physical and virtual world. So what does that mean when we go back? How many people can fit in your worship space per those testing diagrams that I showed? And, do you augment that with a virtual component so some are in the house and some are out? That, of course, leads to an equity issue of who comes to and witnesses live the worship service and who can't. And those are difficult things to navigate. So again, just finding opportunities to be flexible, and just going forward. I like to show this slide just because people tend to forget where we are in this process. It's been such a lengthy process, and obviously the first phase of pandemic is when you're identifying whether it's a risk. The second phase where we've recognized it's a risk and we're all staying at home and buckling down in the third phase. And then of course, the fourth phase is regathering, getting out there and coming back together. And that's sort of where we are. I will highlight that the DC mayor just released an entire packet, not to overload you with more information, but there was an entire packet about sort of reopening, regathering. There's some very useful tips and tools that in some ways complement a lot of what we are talking about today. That just was released about 4 hours ago. So anyway, I hope that all of this leads to us being a more resilient worship community as we start to re-enter our buildings.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. That was really great insight and overview from the world of design and architecture, which is a critical piece here to think about. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers, because that is always such a great part of this kind of conversation and presentation. Looks like we do have our question and answer box. Do we see that there? We have our chat box, and okay. I think we just have a chat box right now. I think we did have a Q&A box, but at the beginning, but we do have a chat box. So if you'd like to, please go to the chat box to share questions that you have for the panelists here. We'd love to spend some time answering those. I guess to get us started, I have a question for George and Merrick, which is, obviously this is Christ Church is a beautiful, thriving parish with that's very well resourced and on the larger end of spectrum of on the larger end in the spectrum of churches in the Episcopal Church. What advice could you give for a smaller parish that wants to do some of the same things in terms of listening and bringing together a good team? Do you have any suggestions how they might pick maybe the key elements of that are similar to what you've done and adapt it for a smaller parish?
George, you want to go first?
Sure. I think start with your leadership, your lay leadership, and then reach out to, I think Merrick's analogy of a search committee, creating a pseudo search committee, is helpful. It better describes what you're trying to do. And so getting key parishioners and thoughtful parishioners to be engaged. Yes, Christ Church has a lot of aspects to it. There are bigger parishes, there certainly are smaller parishes. But I found when we wanted to reopen that it's just, as I mentioned, it's just overwhelming, all of the aspects, whether it's a large church or a small church, and certainly all the information coming at us. So we felt it was best to break it down into smaller parts. And I think that's still the case in a small parish. You can do that with a small parish as well, is have, a couple people work on the worship part, a couple people working on the facilities part, et cetera, and looking at it that way. And then coming together as a group to share your insights and knowledge.
Great. Do you want to add to that, Merrick?
Sure, and I just want to mention that Joe Schwimmer lost his brother this week, and so I just think on behalf of all of us at the Consortium of Untitled Episcopal Churches, we offer our condolences to Joe, and he couldn't be part of this today because of that, but he's very much in our thoughts and prayers. I would say for us to reopen, the big thing for us is it's an issue, it's pastoral and spiritual. I think people are going bonkers right now, and we have to start to regain some normalcy. So that's our raison d'etre, to bring people back and to do it in the safest way possible. In terms of what a smaller church can do, what I'd say is technology is the great leveler today. In my previous church, I started this thing called the Bible Challenge. We got it started and never raised more than $100,000 to make that go. And it's impacted like about 1 million people right now. So, you don't have to have a huge amount of money or a huge campus or a huge congregation to do things because of the internet and the digital world. So I think that's something for each church to think about as we go forward. And one thing I would suggest to people as they do go forward is to try to imagine coming out of this stronger than you came into it. So there are 3 ways you can come out of it. You can come out weaker, or you can try to come out of this as strong as you were. But I think where I find energy is to see if we can come out of this stronger. And there's some ways in which we can move all of our programming online right now and build a church that's going to have a wider impact on more people. So that's something I think no matter what size your church is right now, you can actually go to grow your congregation and your impact. And that grows your giving, because the more impact you have, the more people really want to get behind what you're doing. I can explain more if you want.
That's really well said. I know that I've seen a few questions that have occurred a couple of times, one of which may be somewhat easy. Jim, this was, I think, directed more towards your presentation. It was about humidity levels. And could you say a little bit more about that? And there are a different range of concerns about that. Some people worried about artifacts and, more precious items in a church and how humidity levels affected special features, especially of older buildings, for instance.
Yeah, well, this is all pretty recent, obviously, because we're all struggling to understand how the virus reacts in an environment, how we react to the virus, and what environments are better for us to recover if we have it, and to minimize its spread. So the humidity study was talking about how if you have a humidity level of 40% or higher, now normally in an interior environment, you want a healthy humidity level about 30%. So that is higher than is normally recommended. I mean, obviously you don't want to go in an extreme where humidity can lead to condensation, which and then obviously leads to potential mold issues, et cetera. So it's a balance, but they are now doing immediate studies as we speak about what that humidity level means and how it really can improve our environment that we're in and minimize risk and spread. But to the answer of the artifacts, I mean, like I said, a normal humidity level for an interior environment with a HVAC system is about 30%. So getting it higher, it can put at risk some of these artifacts. I think that's something that we're going to have to further study, because obviously so many churches have a lot of wood on the interiors and a lot of historic artifacts that you want to make sure they're protected.
And I'll also add organs. They're
Yeah,
very complex.
Organs.
Right.
They respond to humidity in very quickly.
Right.
It'll affect a tuning cycle for sure, and the care cycle for the organ. There have been a lot of questions about the waiver that Christ Church has. Is that something, or maybe some of the details of the waiver that you have that you might be able to share with attendees?
Sure. It's to be honest with you, we're in the process of writing them now. So, but when they are prepared, we're happy to share.
Okay, great. There are a lot of people also asked about what your response is for those who are over 65, and paying a special attention to that demographic of the congregation.
Sure. The protocols coming out of the Episcopal Church of Connecticut really recommended that we not have people 65 and older return to church at this time. We've pushed back on that a bit in speaking with our bishops directly about this. I think where we're all coming from is we're going to be very clear that that's a high-risk group and people with any pre-existing condition, but you're adults, and we leave it up to you to make this decision. No one says that someone 65 and older cannot go in a grocery store. They have created times where just people in that age group can go in now, but they can go at any time of the day. They can go into a convenience store. They can buy gas. So to tell them they can't come to worship, that's where we found some pushback, because last Sunday I announced that children 7 and under and adults 65 and up would not be invited back as we reopen. And just in a nice way, I heard from some key people that said that's worth rethinking. And instinctively, it seemed they're absolutely right. So we are going to let them make that decision on their own. But we will encourage them, please be safe, because you're in the most probably dangerous group. And it is recommended to be careful because they're not coming at this time. I will say messaging is really tricky right now. I am now, for the first time, writing out my announcements very carefully and going through with all key staff to figure out, because it's almost like you're on a movie when you give those announcements. And you have no live audience, so you cannot see reactions. And also communicating things like this with a live stream camera 300 feet away has to be done very carefully.
I saw another really interesting question here about 12-step groups, and then another question about outside groups. And I know that when we were talking about putting together today's presentation, we had a little bit of a conversation about 12-step groups, specifically at Christ Church. Anything you want to share with attendees about that? Either George or Merrick?
Well, they're going to be, we have a liaison working with them right now. There was a thought that they could move to a different section of our building. If they come back to what's called the loft, that's where we're thinking of moving our choirs right now. We have 8 different choirs. One of the things we know about singing is that is a much stronger way to spread droplets, chiefly among those doing the singing. So at the rehearsals, we're going to have fewer people at a rehearsal, and they're going to be spread out. And so we're looking to move them to a different section of the building to do that. We cannot have them be in the same section probably where 12-step groups have been coming in and out all day. We're concerned about the touching of door handles, etc., and really the kind of self-policing of each 12-step group. So that's a work in progress for us to try to make a determination about.
So it looks like we're a little bit over 4 o'clock now. We've had some good time for questions. If there may be some additional questions that arise, but if we can't address them now, I think all of the panelists, everybody who's been presenting today, you can reach us by email. I think our contact information will be available, so you can reach out to any of us to ask additional follow-up questions. Of course, I think this has already been posted in the chat, but SEEP will make sure that tomorrow all the material we shared today will be available online, so you'll be able to see that. And they will be sending an email to notify everybody about that so that you'll know to go and look for that information. I know this is a really amazingly important, complicated topic, but I'm really glad that we've had this great team to address some of your questions and concerns. Any last thoughts before we wrap up, friends?
I would mention one, if I may. Because of the internet and things like this right now, we're communicating across the country. Prior to this, with our Sunday forums, we had to think long and hard if we bring in someone from California to give us, a lecture for 45 minutes and 15 minutes Q&A, probably not. Today with Zoom, yes, probably yes. So I would encourage all the churches out there. We've reached out to Roland Williams. He's going to be doing one for us. Think big, think broad. We're going to do one parish, one book study going into that. So to prepare for that and probably send copies of his book to, either all of our top 100 donors or all of our pledgers, period. It builds stewardship, it builds connection, spiritual formation, a sense of identity in the Anglican communion. And it's a one-time opportunity that you normally couldn't pull off. So I'd encourage people, again, think like that, because that's how we're going to go from where we are today to coming out of the pandemic stronger. Be visionary.
Great. It's like creativity, flexibility, relationship. This is all great stuff to help us. So,
and transparency.
And transparency.
Yes.
Well, thanks everyone. We really loved being able to be a part of this, and really grateful to everyone who was able to attend today. So thanks to all of you. Stay safe and healthy, and all the best.
God bless. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.